This is my true story, and I want you to hear it carefully because it is not a story of instant action, but of years of patience, love, betrayal, and the way a man can turn the pain he endures into the quiet power of justice. I spent my whole life raising my son with dedication that most people would call extraordinary, but I never thought of it as extraordinary. It was simply my duty, the duty of a father who believes that love and care are enough to guide a child through life, who believes that sacrifice is not. I spent my youth working long hours, waking up before dawn and returning home after the sun had already set, all to provide for my son, the child I loved more than anything else in this world. Every day I pushed myself, enduring back pain, sleepless nights, and endless fatigue, just so he could have shoes that fit, clothes that were clean, and a warm meal on the table. I sacrificed small comforts, pleasures, and even my pride so he could study in good schools, learn manners, and grow up with opportunities that I had never had. I believed that all of this would be appreciated in time, that he would see the years I poured into him, the sweat and blood of my labor, and one day respect me, not just as a father, but as a man who gave everything for his child. I cooked his favorite meals, stayed awake when he was sick, and listened endlessly to his childish complaints, pretending to be patient even when my body screamed for rest. I never minded the small annoyances or the growing noise of a lively house, because in my heart I thought these sacrifices would forge a bond stronger than anything life could break. I remembered nights when I worked extra shifts to pay for his tuition, when I skipped meals myself so that he could eat, and every time I thought of him sleeping safely in his bed, I felt that the pain and exhaustion were worth it. I believed love would be returned in kind, that gratitude and respect would grow like a tree nurtured over decades. I believed that family meant loyalty, that a son would never strike or demean the hands that raised him, that he would carry the honor of our home and our family name with pride. I gave him advice when asked, and when not asked, I guided him silently, hoping that the wisdom of age would seep into his young heart. I believed that every effort, every sleepless night, every hard-earned coin spent on him would form a foundation of trust and respect that could withstand storms. I thought that by teaching him right from wrong, by showing him compassion, by modeling patience, I was not just raising a child, but molding a man who would one day look back and thank me. I never imagined that this devotion, this lifetime of sacrifice, could be met with cruelty or hatred. I never imagined that the very son I protected could grow to despise me, to see my love as weakness, to strike me as if I were nothing, as if all the years of care and guidance were meaningless. Every day I told myself that love required patience, that mistakes were part of growing up, and that in time, the boy I raised would understand the depth of my devotion. I bought him books, toys, and clothes, not for recognition, but because he deserved them. I listened when he cried, laughed when he succeeded, and held my tongue when he was arrogant, believing that maturity would eventually temper his pride. I thought that I had taught him values, that I had instilled respect, that the foundation I built would never crumble. I thought that family was sacred, that a son would protect a father's dignity the way I protected his life. I thought my sacrifices would be remembered, my devotion respected, my love returned, but life proved otherwise in ways I never imagined. I gave everything, and still, it wasn't enough. I endured cold shoulders, harsh words, and disrespect that slowly eroded the warmth I had built. I forgave mistakes and brushed aside slights, hoping that patience would yield gratitude, but the more I gave, the bolder the disregard became. I worked through illness, pain, and fatigue, keeping my worries to myself, believing that a father's burden was meant to be borne quietly. I trusted that love could endure anything, that my care would shape a better human, and that all my efforts would culminate in respect and understanding in his adulthood. I spent decades giving, hoping, and nurturing, never asking for recognition, never seeking applause. Every day was a lesson, every sacrifice a gift, every ounce of energy a building block for his future. And yet, as years passed, the respect I had envisioned remained distant, replaced by arrogance, impatience, and cruelty. I realized slowly, painfully, that devotion alone could not guarantee gratitude, that love without boundaries could invite contempt, and that even the strongest bonds could be shattered when selfishness overcame reason. I reminded myself often of the long nights I spent worrying about him, the long walks to work, the early mornings and late nights, the coins saved, the meals skipped, the smiles feigned for his happiness. I reminded myself that all of it had a purpose, that my efforts were not in vain, and that even if he failed to recognize them, they were the proof of a lifetime of care. Yet, I felt the sting of betrayal growing, realizing that the boy I raised could turn into a man who would see my weakness as an opportunity to hurt, to mock, and to disrespect the life I had given him. And so, I held on to my devotion while preparing for the moment I could no longer remain silent. I carried my heartbreak alongside my purpose, my anger alongside my love, and my grief alongside my resolve. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every ounce of patience had prepared me for the day I would act, not with rashness, not with violence, but with strategy, wisdom, and a clear mind, because a lifetime of devotion deserved a response that would honor all that I had endured. As my son grew older, I began to notice changes in his behavior, subtle at first, but growing sharper with each passing day. He spoke to me with impatience, ignoring the advice I gave with so much care, as if my words were nothing more than noise in the background. What once was respect slowly turned into irritation, and that irritation became open defiance. The boy I had nurtured, the child I had protected, began to show arrogance that pierced my heart like cold steel, leaving me unsure whether to be angry or sad at the man he was becoming. He began to dismiss my presence, walking past me without acknowledgement, his eyes shifting to screens or friends as if I were invisible. He interrupted me in conversations, spoke over me in front of neighbors and friends, and made jokes at my expense. Small acts of disrespect became habitual, and even when I tried to guide him with patience, he rolled his eyes or smirked as though my words held no value. I could feel my lifelong devotion being tested daily, and it hurt more than any physical blow ever could. At school events and gatherings, his arrogance became more visible. Teachers commented on his lack of manners, neighbors whispered about his temper, and friends joked about his audacity. I defended him quietly, hoping his behavior was a phase, a moment of youthful rebellion that would pass with maturity. I reminded myself of all the nights I worked overtime to buy him books and clothes, of all the mornings I woke with aching bones to prepare him for school, and I prayed that these sacrifices would eventually guide him toward respect and understanding. Yet, the arrogance only grew stronger. He demanded things without gratitude, ignored guidance without remorse, and mocked the values I had instilled. He became loud, proud, and impatient, acting as though the world owed him everything he wanted. I watched silently, holding back my anger, reminding myself that patience had always been my virtue. I told myself that one day he would recognize the care and effort behind every act, that he would understand the price I paid to raise him into a responsible man. The more he disrespected me, the more my sorrow grew, but I held on to hope. I remembered how he used to run to me for comfort, how he once clung to my hands when he was scared, how he had trusted me as his protector. I believed that beneath the arrogance, beneath the harsh words, there was still the boy I loved. I reminded myself that guidance sometimes meant waiting, that correction required timing, and that punishment without wisdom could destroy rather than heal. I began noticing how he mocked me in private and in public, laughing when I wasn't looking, making sly remarks to friends about my age, my tiredness, my quiet nature. Each incident cut deeper than the last, not because it hurt my body, but because it wounded my heart and spirit. I questioned whether all the sacrifices, all the sleepless nights, all the labor and love I poured into him were truly valued. And the answer became increasingly clear. He did not see my devotion, he saw weakness. I remembered the nights I went without food so he could eat, the mornings I woke early to make sure he had clean clothes, the times I worked double shifts so he could attend classes and sports. And yet, here he was, turning every act of love into an opportunity for mockery. My chest ached with the weight of disappointment, but I refused to show my weakness, for I knew that anger without control would only feed his pride and diminish my dignity further. As his arrogance and disrespect grew, I realized that patience alone was not enough. The lessons I had hoped to teach through example and quiet guidance were being ignored. I understood that he needed to feel the consequences of his actions, to witness the results of his disregard for the man who had given him everything. It was no longer just a test of patience. It had become a matter of principle, a matter of restoring order, dignity, and the respect that had been lost over the years. I watched him sneer at my efforts, dismiss my warnings, and flaunt my love as weakness. Each insult, each act of defiance, added to a growing resolve within me, a determination to ensure that the arrogance he flaunted would not go unchallenged. I began to collect moments, small observations, pieces of his behavior that demonstrated his disregard for rules, morals, and responsibility. Every careless word, every lie, every act of disrespect was stored in my mind like bricks in a wall, building the foundation for the lesson that was yet to come. Despite the heartbreak, I kept my composure. I reminded myself that reaction without strategy would accomplish nothing. I could not hit back. I could not yell endlessly. I could not let rage dictate my actions. Years of devotion had taught me patience, and patience now had to be transformed into planning. I would teach him respect, not through shouting, but through a carefully constructed act that would leave no doubt about the consequences of arrogance, defiance, and betrayal of family trust. I studied his routines, his habits, and the way he interacted with others, noting every lie and every exaggeration that fueled his pride. I realized that his arrogance was not just personal. It extended into his work, his friendships, and his reputation. I knew that if I struck with truth, at the right time, in the right way, the impact would be permanent. The disrespect he displayed in the home would mirror in the world outside, forcing him to confront the reality he had ignored for so long. Every evening, I reflected on his words and actions, imagining the moment when he would finally understand the depth of my devotion and the cost of his disrespect. I reminded myself of the nights I endured physical fatigue, emotional strain, and quiet suffering to build him a life of comfort, respect, and opportunity. I realized that the same patience I had shown would now serve as a foundation for justice, for an education in respect he could not ignore or mock. As the weeks passed, his arrogance and recklessness only provided more evidence for the lesson I planned. I documented each act, each insult, each dismissal, understanding that the power of truth would outweigh any argument, any confrontation, or any shouting. The time of patience was ending, and the time of reckoning was approaching. I was ready to transform years of silent endurance into one powerful action that would restore dignity, demand respect, and ensure he would never again see a father's devotion as weakness. It was a day that began like any other, but ended in a storm I could never forget. My son, full of arrogance and impatience, grew increasingly agitated over trivial matters. What started as a minor disagreement quickly escalated, and his anger found its target in me, the father who had given him everything. I tried to reason, tried to calm him, tried to remind him of respect and family values, but my words bounced off the walls of his stubborn pride. He was deaf to logic, blind to love, and consumed by his own fury. Suddenly, the first slap landed across my cheek. Shock coursed through me, but I stood firm, unwilling to retreat. He struck again and again, each blow sharper than the last, fueled by years of unchecked arrogance. My teeth rattled, lips split, and pain radiated through my jaw and skull, but I did not scream. I did not strike back. I endured, knowing that physical reaction would only validate his cruelty. Instead, I focused on counting the blows, understanding each one as a testament to the disrespect I had endured silently for years. By the time the 20th slap struck, my teeth loosened and my face bore the marks of betrayal and violence. Every strike was a memory of sacrifices I had made, nights without sleep, meals I had skipped so he could eat. Hours of labor endured so he could pursue his dreams. My body ached, but the ache in my heart was stronger, for he had not just hurt my flesh, he had attacked my dignity, my legacy, and the fatherly devotion I had offered without question. Pain and heartbreak mingled into resolve as I realized that this would not be an ending, but a turning point. Even as he raised his hand for the 21st strike, I caught a clarity in the chaos. I understood that I could not let this moment define me, that I could not allow his violence to break my spirit completely. Every slap became a symbol, not of my weakness, but of the lesson I was preparing. I knew that revenge, when executed with wisdom, could strike deeper than anger or retaliation ever could. I did not respond physically. I did not scream in rage. I remained silent, gathering strength from my patience and the knowledge that justice could be delivered in another form. Once the violence ended, I felt the weight of my body and the ache of my broken teeth, but I also felt a flicker of purpose ignite within me. I understood that words alone could no longer correct his arrogance, and that physical endurance, while admirable, would not change his behavior. What was needed was a plan, a methodical action that would strip away his pride, expose his faults, and restore respect in a way he could not ignore or dismiss. My pain would become fuel, my suffering the foundation of the lesson he would learn. I reflected on the years I had devoted to him, the sacrifices unnoticed and unappreciated. I remembered guiding him through schoolwork, coaching him through challenges, waking early to ensure he was fed and ready, and enduring countless hardships so that he could live comfortably. And yet, here he was, repaying that devotion with brutality and disrespect, showing that he valued nothing of what I had given. Anger mingled with sorrow, and sorrow became resolve, forming a plan that would transform victimhood into empowerment. The first step was acknowledgement. I acknowledged the pain, the betrayal, and the humiliation without letting it define me. I understood that this moment would be a catalyst, a turning point where patience and endurance would convert into strategic action. I visualized the outcome, exposing his lies, revealing his arrogance, and letting the world see the man he truly was, not the image he had carefully constructed. Every slap became a building block, each strike a reminder of the depth of his betrayal, and each ache a motivator for justice. I also reflected on the lessons I wanted him to learn. Respect is not optional, loyalty is not disposable, and actions have consequences. The pain in my jaw, the loosened teeth, and the emotional wounds were reminders of the consequences of unchecked arrogance and disregard for others. I understood that the world beyond our home could teach him far more effectively than shouting, scolding, or retaliation ever could. I began to gather evidence, noting patterns in his behavior, tracking mistakes, and documenting his arrogance in ways that could not be denied. In the days following the violence, I tended to my wounds quietly, but my mind never rested. Each moment of reflection sharpened my resolve. Each memory of past disrespect reinforced the need for action. I realized that this was not just about revenge, but about education, correction, and restoration of dignity. The physical pain reminded me of my vulnerability, but also of my strength, and I understood that the lesson I was about to deliver would be far more effective than any physical confrontation. I began to plan carefully, thinking about how to expose the truth in a manner that would resonate. I considered who would be the audience, what evidence would carry the greatest weight, and how to ensure that the lesson would be remembered permanently. I understood that public exposure, combined with undeniable proof, could transform arrogance into humility and disrespect into respect. My own suffering became the blueprint for a strategic action that would leave a permanent mark. I knew the moment of the attack would not be forgotten, but I also knew it had to serve a purpose beyond memory. I channeled the pain, heartbreak, and humiliation into a focused plan. I would gather the secrets, the lies, and the misdeeds he had hidden, and use them to ensure accountability. I would not react with anger or violence, but with truth, precision, and patience. My body bore the marks of his cruelty, but my spirit, fortified by years of love and endurance, prepared for the ultimate lesson. Every night I reflected, strategized, and planned, ensuring that no detail would be overlooked. The day of violence had become the day of awakening, a turning point that demanded resolution. I would take the evidence, the knowledge of his misconduct, and deliver it in a way that could not be ignored or denied. The lesson would be permanent, just as the pain he inflicted had been permanent. But this time, the outcome would favor justice and restore respect. By the end of that week, I had prepared, gathered, and organized everything. The plan was clear, the proof undeniable, and the moment of reckoning approaching. My patience had transformed into strategy, my endurance into action, and my heartbreak into resolve. The lesson I was about to teach would not only correct his behavior, but also restore the balance that had been lost in our home. The violence he inflicted had created the opportunity, and I would use it wisely. I sat alone in my small room, the pain of my body matched only by the ache in my heart. Blood from my lips stained the handkerchief I held, each drop a reminder of the violence I had endured. My teeth were loose, my jaw throbbed, but my mind was sharper than ever, burning with a quiet fire. I could feel the weight of every slap, every strike, every humiliation that my son had poured upon me. I remembered the nights when I worked long hours, skipping meals and sleep, so he could have everything he wanted. I recalled the winters when I shivered in thin clothes, just so he could stay warm, the sacrifices no one ever thanked me for. Every birthday I celebrated for him, every reward I denied myself, every moment I endured hardship, all seemed meaningless now. He had struck me as if my life, my love, and my sacrifices were worthless, as if I were nothing but a shadow in his world. I thought about the first day he was born, the tiny hands that had gripped my finger, the innocent smile that once warmed my heart. How had that boy, once full of wonder and laughter, become a man who could raise his hand against his father? The realization cut me deeper than any physical blow ever could, and the room felt colder than winter nights I had endured alone. Tears threatened, but I swallowed them, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me broken by his hands. Pain and anger coiled together inside me, a silent storm that I did not know how to release. I replayed every moment of my sacrifices, every piece of love I had poured into raising him, now met with hatred and violence. My body hurt, yes, but my soul ached far more, the betrayal heavier than any wound on my skin. I could no longer see him as my son, but as someone I had to outsmart, someone who had betrayed the very core of family and trust. I thought of the neighbors who had once admired our bond, the friends who had seen me as a devoted father, now witnesses to my son's cruelty. I imagined their faces, the shock they would feel if they saw the truth of what he had done, the boy they had cheered for now revealed as ungrateful and violent. The anger in me slowly turned into a calculated resolve. I knew that my pain could become a weapon if I was patient. I would not strike back with fists or words, but with truth, evidence, and timing, the tools that could end his arrogance once and for all. Hours passed as I sat in silence, my jaw throbbing, my body aching, yet my mind was clear and focused. I remembered the quiet sacrifices, the endless labor, the sleepless nights, the careful guidance I had given him, all mocked by his hands. But within that pain, I found clarity. His actions had given me a map, a way to strike without risking more harm to myself. I understood that vengeance did not need to be loud, did not need to be violent, but had to be precise, public, and unforgettable. I began imagining the steps I would take, the evidence I would gather, the moment when his arrogance would meet accountability. Every slur, every insult, every slap that tore at my body and dignity became a point of strategy, a reminder of what was at stake. I could feel my anger settle into a cold, calculated determination, a silent power that was stronger than any physical retaliation. Pain had shaped me, betrayal had sharpened me, and patience had armed me for the moment when justice would arrive. The night deepened, and the house was quiet, except for the echo of my thoughts. I thought about the future, about how his children, friends, and colleagues would one day witness the collapse of the man who had struck his own father. I realized that the silence I kept now was more powerful than yelling, more effective than striking back, and infinitely more satisfying. I promised myself that I would not act in haste, that every step of my revenge would be methodical, precise, and undeniable. My body was weak, my teeth loose, my hands shaking from the pain, but my mind was alive with strategy. I would convert the shame he had inflicted into a lesson that would be remembered for a lifetime, not just by him, but by everyone who mattered. Each breath I took, each throb in my jaw, reminded me of the stakes and the necessity of patience. I was no longer a victim. I was a grandfather armed with time, wisdom, and the determination to see justice fulfilled. The hours turned into dawn, but I remained seated, plotting, reflecting, and letting my anger transform into power. Every slap, every insult, every act of disrespect became a part of the plan, a fuel that would ignite when the right moment came. I knew that soon the world would see the truth of his character, the boy who struck his father 21 times, revealed in full. I smiled faintly, understanding that suffering had a purpose, and my silence was the first stroke of retribution. I understood that shouting, fighting, or showing anger would not solve anything. Reacting with words or fists would only feed his arrogance and make him stronger in his own eyes. Every slap, every insult had to be met with a response far greater than he could imagine. I knew that patience and planning would be my strongest allies, more powerful than any moment of rage. I began to think carefully about the consequences of his actions and how they could be turned into lessons. Each blow, each word he had thrown at me, each act of disrespect became a guide for what I needed to do. I realized that my pain could become a tool, my suffering a weapon, and my silence a shield. I would not act out of anger, but out of purpose, knowing the outcome would be just and undeniable. I thought about his life outside the home, the life he proudly showed to his friends and colleagues. He had built a reputation of success, charm, and professionalism, a facade of a man who could do no wrong. But I knew the cracks in that image, the mistakes, the lies, and the selfishness he carried like a hidden burden. Those cracks would become the door through which justice would enter, silent but effective. I imagined the look on his face when he realized that every secret he had kept, every misdeed he had hidden, would be revealed to the people he respected most. The satisfaction would not come from yelling or fighting, but from seeing the walls he built crumble. I understood that the timing had to be perfect, the proof undeniable, and the method precise. Only then would the lesson be learned, and the arrogance destroyed. I remembered the nights of sacrifice, the years of patience, the endless support I had given him. Every hour of toil, every denied comfort, every sleepless night had been meant to guide him to a better path. But instead, he had struck me, mocked me, and tried to erase the respect I had earned. That disrespect had created a responsibility in me to respond in a way he would never forget. I realized that revenge did not need to be loud, cruel, or destructive. It only needed to be smart, complete, and undeniable. Every detail of his dishonesty, every act of selfishness, every hidden lie would be collected carefully. I would turn the very things he was proud of into evidence against him, a mirror of his true character. I thought about his colleagues and friends, the people who admired him, the people who looked up to him. They would be witnesses to his downfall, not through gossip or rumor, but through facts that could not be denied. His reputation, the one he used to show off to the world, would collapse like a house built on sand. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that justice would come not from me striking him, but from truth revealed. I began planning how I would gather the proof without exposing myself or creating risk. Screenshots, bank records, emails, any hidden dealings he thought were private, each piece would be preserved. Every detail would form a picture so clear that no one could dispute the evidence, no one could defend him. I knew this approach would hurt far more than anger ever could, because it would pierce the pride he relied on. I thought about his children, the people who would look up to him one day, the ones who would witness his actions. They would see the truth, learn the cost of arrogance, and understand that disrespect has real consequences. I wanted them to understand that words and actions have weight, and pride built on cruelty can crumble overnight. That knowledge would stay with them, shaping their respect and shaping the legacy of lessons I wanted to leave. I sat quietly for hours, letting the plan form in my mind like a map, each step clear and precise. The pain in my jaw, the loosened teeth, the bruises, they were reminders of what had been done to me. But they were also reminders of why I could not act hastily, why I had to wait, plan, and execute with care. The calm in me grew as I realized that patience would transform my suffering into power and pain into justice. I promised myself that I would not let this moment pass without using it to its fullest effect. Every slap, every insult would become part of the lesson, every bruise a fuel for the strategy I was forming. I would not seek revenge through anger, but through a method that would leave him powerless and exposed. The more I thought, the more determined I became, understanding that this was the only way to restore balance. Finally, I knew the moment of decision had come. I would gather the secrets, the lies, the hidden misdeeds, and present them where they mattered most. I would show the world, his colleagues, and his children the truth, and let him face the consequences of his actions. The plan was clear, the method precise, and the outcome inevitable. I began collecting every piece of evidence I could find, knowing it would take patience and care. Every message, every email, every hidden document became part of the story I needed to tell. I went through his phone, his computer, his accounts, and even his personal notes, carefully and quietly. Nothing was too small, nothing irrelevant. Every detail mattered in showing the full truth of his actions. Each screenshot I saved was a step closer to justice. Each bank record, each record of dishonesty, each secret transaction became a brick in the wall I was building. I organized everything chronologically so that the story of his deception would be clear and undeniable. I knew that once he saw the result of my work, his arrogance would crumble, and he would have nowhere to hide. I worked slowly, meticulously, making copies and backups of every file, fearing nothing could be lost. The pain in my jaw, the loosened teeth from his violence, reminded me why this plan had to succeed. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about showing the world the truth of the man he really was. Every piece of evidence had to speak louder than words, louder than anger, louder than denial. I remembered every time he mocked me, every insult, every act of cruelty. I thought about the pride he showed in his workplace, the reputation he maintained among friends. That pride would become his downfall when the truth reached the people who admired him most. I would make sure the world saw him as he truly was, stripped of all his lies and pretense. I went through his hidden emails, the messages he thought no one would ever find. I found conversations where he had lied, cheated, and manipulated others for his gain. I traced the flow of money, the deceit in contracts, the false reports he had made to appear successful. Every secret I uncovered added fuel to the fire of the justice I was planning. I also gathered evidence from his colleagues and clients who had been wronged. I collected testimonies, notes, and any proof that could show a pattern of dishonesty. Each piece reinforced the others, creating a complete and undeniable record of his actions. I realized that when all these secrets came together, the impact would be overwhelming. I spent hours verifying every fact, checking dates, double-checking details, and ensuring accuracy. I could not afford a single mistake. One wrong detail could weaken the entire plan. My focus sharpened with every passing day, transforming my heartbreak into determination. I worked quietly, knowing that patience and precision were the keys to true justice. I imagined the moment I would hand over the evidence to his boss, the look on his face. He would be powerless to deny the truth, unable to hide behind charm or lies. The letters, the files, the screenshots, everything was organized to hit with maximum effect. Every act he thought was secret would be exposed, leaving him vulnerable and ashamed. I also thought about his children, who would see him exposed for the first time. They would witness the consequences of arrogance, cruelty, and betrayal. The lesson would not be lost on them. It would stay with them forever, shaping their understanding of respect. I wanted them to know that no one, no matter how proud or powerful, is above the truth. I worked late into the nights, the quiet of the house my only companion. Every page I printed, every file I copied, felt heavier with the weight of justice. The plan was not born of anger alone, but of wisdom, patience, and a desire to restore balance. I knew the outcome would bring satisfaction not only to me, but to those who had suffered silently from his actions. I reminded myself that this revenge would be silent, yet powerful. No yelling, no confrontation, no public shame from me directly. It would all be done through truth. The envelope I was preparing would speak louder than any shout, louder than any argument. It would leave him powerless, stripped of pride, and forced to face reality. I organized everything into a single clear package, leaving nothing out. The order of events, the evidence, the documentation, it all formed a complete picture of who he was. I knew that once this reached his boss, the impact would be immediate and undeniable. The boy who had slapped me 21 times would have no way to defend himself. Each piece I collected reminded me of my strength, not my weakness. I had endured his violence and insult, yet I was the one holding power now. The plan was more than revenge. It was a statement that truth and patience always triumph over cruelty. Every file, every note, every secret was a testament to the justice that was coming. I double-checked everything, knowing that perfection was essential. There could be no gaps, no mistakes, no chance for him to twist the story. I had transformed my suffering into preparation, my heartbreak into strategy. The quiet work of these nights gave me calm and purpose, more powerful than anger ever could. I finally set aside the organized files, the envelope ready to deliver. I felt the weight of years, the pain of betrayal, the marks of his violence, all turning into resolve. Every slap, every insult, every disrespectful word had led me to this moment. Now the path was clear. Deliver the truth, and let the consequences fall exactly where they should. The day had come to deliver the evidence I had collected over weeks of careful work. I dressed simply, but with a calm purpose that steadied my heart and mind. The envelope, thick with documents, screenshots, and proofs, felt heavier than any burden I had carried in years. It was not just paper. It was the story of his arrogance, his lies, his betrayal, and his disrespect. I walked into his office building slowly, observing the familiar surroundings that once symbolized his pride. The polished floors, the busy employees, the smell of coffee and paper, all reminders of the life he had built on deception. I clutched the envelope tightly, knowing that inside were the secrets he had tried so hard to hide. Every step I took was deliberate, measured, a reflection of the patience I had shown throughout his cruelty. I reached his boss's office and stood quietly outside the door, waiting for the right moment to hand over the truth. No anger rushed through me, no loud accusations, only the calm determination of a man who had endured too much. I knocked softly, and when the door opened, I greeted his boss with a nod, saying nothing at all. The envelope in my hand spoke louder than any words I could have uttered. I handed it over with steady hands, my heart steady, despite the years of pain and violence I had suffered. Inside, everything he had hidden was laid bare. The emails, the bank slips, the screenshots of his lies. I watched as the boss took it, curiosity and a hint of concern crossing his face. I did not need to explain, did not need to justify, did not need to speak. Truth needed no decoration. I walked out slowly, leaving the envelope in the hands of someone who could finally act on it. The silence of the corridor echoed with my calm resolve, my dignity heavier than the fear he had once inspired. I knew that once the contents were read, the consequences would unfold naturally, like a domino falling in perfect order. There would be no shouting, no drama, no confrontation, only the power of undeniable truth. As I left the building, I imagined the moment he would discover the betrayal exposed before everyone who mattered in his life, his colleagues, his boss, the people he had tried to impress with lies, all would see the man he truly was. The arrogance he had worn like armor would vanish, replaced by shock, shame, and disbelief. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the consequences were coming without my hand needing to strike. I remembered the 21 slaps he had delivered, the pain in my jaw, the loosened teeth, the humiliation in my own home. Every bruise, every cut, every insult had led to this moment of justice. No yelling, no retaliation, no loud revenge. It was a measured, precise exposure that could not be denied. Every secret, carefully gathered, now had the power to destroy the false image he had built. I thought about the fear that would cross his face when his lies were discovered, the shock that would settle into the realization that he had been powerless from the start. The whispers in the office, the shocked glances from colleagues, the questions that would follow, all inevitable. And I felt no anger in that moment, only a calm sense that justice was finally walking its proper path. I also considered the lesson his children would learn when the truth reached them. They would see that arrogance, disrespect, and violence had consequences that could not be escaped. They would witness firsthand that their father's actions had led to humiliation and loss, even at work. It was a lesson that could never be erased, a moment that would shape their understanding of integrity and respect. I reflected on the long nights I had spent gathering evidence, organizing files, and preparing the envelope. Every detail, every copy, every backup had been necessary to ensure that nothing could be hidden or denied. The work had been painstaking, but it had been worth it. The calmness I felt walking away from the office was deeper than any satisfaction anger could provide. I knew the impact would not be immediate, but it would be inevitable. Once the boss read the documents and saw the proofs, action would follow swiftly. He would face the consequences of his arrogance, his violence, and his deception, and I would watch quietly, knowing the lesson had been delivered perfectly. The envelope represented more than revenge. It was truth distilled into action. It was proof that patience, strategy, and careful preparation were stronger than rage. I had endured humiliation, pain, and disrespect, but now I was the one with power. The young man who had thought himself untouchable would find that no lie, no insult, no act of cruelty could withstand the weight of proof. As I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in years. The burden of betrayal, the scars of his violence, the anger that had simmered, all had transformed into quiet, unstoppable justice. No yelling, no fists, no shouting, just evidence, truth, and consequences. And that, I knew, was far more powerful than any moment of rage. I thought about what awaited him, the loss of reputation, the humiliation in front of those he had tried to impress, the doubt in his colleagues' eyes. The consequences were coming without my direct involvement, like a silent shadow descending on everything he had built. It was a lesson learned without a word, without a scream, without the need for confrontation. The envelope was justice, and I had delivered it calmly, firmly, and perfectly. The walk back home was peaceful. The air felt lighter, the streets quieter, the world somehow in balance again. I had turned my pain into power, my suffering into strategy, my heartbreak into justice, and I knew, deep in my heart, that the lesson would not be forgotten. Days passed slowly, but I knew the moment of reckoning had begun the instant the envelope reached his boss. I had returned home, sitting quietly, imagining the chaos that would unfold in the office. The truth was unstoppable now, a tide that could not be turned back. Every secret, every lie, every hidden misdeed was about to collapse around him. I thought about the countless times he had mocked me, disrespected me, and struck me without mercy. Each of those memories fueled a quiet satisfaction as I pictured the consequences arriving. The arrogance he had carried like armor would crumble, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. There was no yelling, no confrontation, no dramatics, only the inevitable weight of truth pressing down. Word spread faster than I expected. Whispers in the office turned into hushed conversations, glances full of suspicion and disbelief. Colleagues who once praised him now avoided eye contact, unsure how to confront the reality in front of them. The empire he had built on lies and deceit was dissolving, and he had no defense. I remembered the slaps he had given me, the bloodied teeth, the humiliation in my own home. Each blow now seemed almost symbolic of the downfall he was experiencing. The universe, in its own way, had corrected the imbalance, turning his violence back upon him through the power of exposure. And I felt no joy in his suffering, only calm acknowledgement that justice had arrived. I could imagine his face when he first realized that nothing could hide the truth. The shock, the panic, the futile attempts to deny what was laid bare before the eyes of his superiors. Every lie he had counted on, Every facade he had created crumbled in front of the people who mattered. He was powerless, stripped of pride, stripped of status, stripped of the false security he had relied on. The realization was brutal, but fair. Every hand that had slapped me, every insult thrown, every moment of arrogance and entitlement had led to this moment. He had built his life on deception, thinking he could escape accountability. Now, he learned that the truth was sharper than any fist, heavier than any insult, and more permanent than any crime of rage. I thought about the reactions around him, the whispers, the doubts, the shocked glances. The colleagues who once admired him now questioned his integrity. The boss, holding the envelope, would have seen every betrayal, every dishonesty, every cutthroat action he had taken. His professional reputation, carefully crafted over years, disintegrated within days. I reflected on how justice had arrived silently. No yelling, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just the undeniable facts laid bare. He had thought that hitting me 21 times made him strong, but I had shown him that patience, strategy, and truth were far more powerful than rage and arrogance. I pictured his face when he was finally cornered in front of everyone who mattered in his professional life. The confusion, the disbelief, the shame, and the realization that his image was destroyed. These were the moments that brought me peace. No revenge is sweeter than that which comes without words, without emotion, without the need to argue. It is a lesson learned purely through the undeniable weight of evidence. I remembered every painful night, every sleepless hour, every moment I endured while planning this. The envelope had been more than paper. It was strategy, patience, justice, and the culmination of my endurance. I had turned my suffering into action, my heartbreak into precision, my humiliation into a lesson he could not forget, and that I knew was far more powerful than any shouting match or confrontation could ever be. I thought about the moment he would finally understand that power was not in fists, not in arrogance, not in cruelty. It was in truth, in evidence, and in patience. Every secret I had gathered, every lie he had told, every crime he had committed, exposed. And there was no way to hide, no way to escape, no way to repair the damage. I felt the weight of satisfaction settle in my chest, not the satisfaction of anger, but of justice served. I had endured pain, violence, and humiliation, but I had not been defeated. My spirit remained intact, my resolve unbroken, and my dignity preserved. He, on the other hand, had lost everything he had counted on: status, respect, and control. And as the days passed, I observed the ripple effect of his collapse. Colleagues who once smiled at him now kept their distance. The whispering continued, a constant reminder that deception has a price and that arrogance invites exposure. He had learned the lesson too late, and it was unforgettable. I understood that revenge does not require malice, only patience, precision, and truth. No emotion, no confrontation, just undeniable facts that could not be ignored or twisted. And in that quiet satisfaction, I found peace. The empire he had built on deceit and violence was gone, and the man who had struck me 21 times was powerless. I reflected on the journey, my pain, his violence, the patience, and the calculated delivery of truth. All of it had led to this perfect collapse, a lesson that would last him a lifetime. The moral was clear. Power built on lies, cruelty, and arrogance cannot survive exposure. And my suffering had not been in vain. It had become the force that toppled him. After the collapse of his professional world, I returned to my quiet home. No applause, no cheers, no gloating, just calm and silence. I did not need recognition for what I had done. The truth had done its work, and that was enough. I reflected on how every slap, every insult, every act of violence he had committed against me had fueled this moment. The pain I endured, the blood I spat, the dignity I maintained, all of it led to this perfect, silent justice. Revenge had been served, not with emotion, but with precision. It was far stronger than any shouting, far more permanent than any angry confrontation could have been. I remembered nights spent planning, nights spent collecting evidence, nights spent imagining the exact moment when truth would strike. The envelope, the delivery, the exposure, it was all carefully calculated. There was no room for error, no chance for him to twist the facts. Everything was laid bare, undeniable, permanent. The house felt quieter now. The tension, the fear, the unease, it had all dissipated, replaced by a calm I had not felt in years. I did not rub his failure in his face, nor did I shout from rooftops. I let silence carry the weight of justice. I thought about the lesson he had learned, though I did not need to remind him. The whispers in the office, the disbelief in his colleagues' eyes, the collapse of his empire. These were reminders that actions have consequences. My silence amplified the punishment without a single word from me. It was a lesson that would stay with him forever. I reflected on the irony. He had believed that hitting me 21 times made him strong. He had believed that arrogance and cruelty could build an unbreakable shield. Yet it was patience, strategy, and truth that proved stronger than fists or insults. And in that realization, I found peace. The ache in my jaw remained, a permanent reminder of the violence I endured. But it no longer represented weakness. It represented the strength to endure and the patience to plan. I had turned my suffering into power, my humiliation into precision, and my heartbreak into action. Every pang of pain had been transformed into justice. I watched the days pass, observing the ripple effect of his downfall. Colleagues whispered, neighbors murmured, and friends hesitated to engage with him. His reputation was shattered, his pride destroyed, and his arrogance replaced by a lasting humility he could not escape. I did not need to add words. The world itself had enforced the lesson. I understood now that silence was my greatest weapon. No yelling, no pleading, no confrontation. It had been unnecessary. Truth, exposure, and patience had accomplished more than any argument ever could. The power of quiet justice had reshaped his world completely. I thought of the contrast between us. He had struck out of anger, recklessness, and pride. I had responded with thought, strategy, and patience. He had used violence. I had used truth. And the results spoke for themselves. I walked through the house slowly, feeling the calm that came from knowing justice was done. No celebrations, no revenge fantasies, only the satisfaction of seeing a life rebuilt on truth rather than lies. He had lost what he valued most, not because of me personally, but because of the undeniable reality of his actions. Every slap, every insult, every moment of arrogance had been mirrored in the collapse of his carefully constructed life. I understood that my silence carried weight that words never could. No explanations were needed, no threats were necessary. The world had watched, the consequences had arrived, and he had nowhere to hide. It was justice that did not yell, that did not scream, that did not seek attention. It simply existed and endured. I reflected on the lessons this life had taught me. Anger without patience is empty. Violence without consequence is temporary. But truth, carefully applied and silently delivered, endures forever. I thought about the future and the quiet peace that had settled over my household. There was no tension, no fear, no doubt about respect. The lesson had been taught and internalized, and the ripple effects of that single, silent action would continue for years. I had ensured that my son, once arrogant and cruel, had been humbled permanently. I considered my own journey, the pain, the endurance, the planning, and the execution. Each step had been deliberate, each moment of suffering transformed into power. I had turned my broken teeth, my bleeding lips, and my aching jaw into tools of justice. I had endured, waited, and acted, not in anger, but in calm resolve. I understood the ultimate truth. Revenge does not need to be loud to be effective. It does not require celebration or malice. It only requires patience, clarity, and the courage to act when the moment is right. And that, I knew, is the most permanent power a man can have. Finally, I sat back, letting the quiet of my home envelop me. No words needed to be spoken, no faces needed to witness my satisfaction. The lesson had been delivered. Justice had been done. I looked at my hands, once hit, once helpless, now steady and calm. They had endured the pain, and now they were instruments of truth. I had turned suffering into strength, humiliation into strategy, and violence into silence that carried the heaviest weight of all. And in that stillness, I felt complete peace. Now, as an old man, I sit quietly and recall the events that shaped this chapter of my life. Time has softened the pain, but it has not diminished the lessons I learned. I think about the son who struck me 21 times, believing that violence could dominate and break my spirit. He thought strength came from force, from anger, from showing no mercy. But I understood something he never could, that true strength comes from patience, clarity, and calm resolve. I had endured, I had planned, and I had acted with purpose rather than emotion. Every blow he gave me had fueled the resolve that now sat comfortably in my chest. I had transformed suffering into power, pain into strategy, and humiliation into action. I reflect on the nights I spent collecting evidence, organizing it carefully, making sure that every fact was undeniable. Each bank slip, each hidden transaction, every record of dishonesty became a tool of justice. I did not rush. I did not act impulsively. I waited for the precise moment when truth would strike hardest. That is the power of patience, a lesson far deeper than any physical confrontation. I think of the moment I walked into his office, the envelope in my hand, and my heart steady. I felt no anger, no vengeance, only the quiet knowledge that justice would be served. The world witnessed what words could not convey, the collapse of arrogance, the fall of pride, the unraveling of lies. And I walked away, leaving no shouting, no confrontation, just truth that spoke for itself. I remember the aftermath, how whispers filled the office halls, how colleagues' eyes betrayed disbelief, and how my son's empire crumbled almost instantly. He realized too late that deception cannot withstand evidence, that lies cannot outlast truth. Every moment he had mocked, every insult he had given, every act of cruelty had led him to this point. And I had been patient enough to let the consequences manifest fully, without interference, without noise. I consider my own pain, the broken teeth, the bleeding lips, the nights spent in quiet suffering. That pain was not in vain. It became the foundation for justice. I had learned that suffering, endured with patience and wisdom, can be transformed into the most effective weapon of all. Anger fades. Words can be twisted. Violence can be denied, but proof, truth carefully collected, remains permanent. I think about the silence that followed. It was not emptiness. It was the weight of realization, the calm that comes when justice has been enacted without fanfare. I did not need to gloat. I did not need to shout. The world had delivered the message for me, and my son could do nothing to escape it. I also reflect on the nature of respect and obedience. He had believed that disrespect could go unpunished, that cruelty could pass without consequence. He learned in the most permanent way that actions always have repercussions, and that pride can collapse faster than it is built. Discipline, respect, and consequences are not built on fear. They are built on accountability. I think of how this lesson will remain with him forever. He cannot erase it from memory, cannot undo the exposure, cannot reclaim the empire he lost, and that permanence brings me a sense of peace that words cannot convey. Revenge, when executed with patience and truth, is a quiet and enduring force. I reflect on myself, not as a victim, but as a man who endured, who planned, and who acted with dignity. I preserved my calm while he lost his control. I let strategy, patience, and truth do the work that anger and violence never could. That is a lesson I carry into my old age with pride, not malice. I also think about life's strange irony. Those who strike with hands often lose to those who strike with mind. He had tried to dominate me with force, but I responded with foresight and persistence. His downfall was not instant, but inevitable once truth was applied. And that inevitability is a lesson far more powerful than any threat or confrontation could ever teach. I remember the quiet moments after it all ended, the calm that filled my house, and the peace I felt in knowing the lesson was complete. No shouting, no retaliation, no public spectacle. I let truth, evidence, and patience create the outcome. I saw the consequences unfold in full, and that was the only satisfaction I needed. Justice, I realized, does not need noise. It only needs precision and permanence. Finally, I reflect on what I want the world to understand from my story. Love, patience, and sacrifice are powerful, but when met with cruelty and disrespect, action is necessary. Revenge does not need to be loud. It does not need to be violent. It needs only to be true, deliberate, and effective. And in that truth lies a strength no one can ever break. As I look back, I understand that my son's arrogance and cruelty cannot overshadow the lessons learned. I endured, I acted, and I ensured that justice was not fleeting, it was permanent. The scars in my jaw, the pain in my heart, all became symbols of endurance and triumph. And that triumph, quiet and unshakable, is my legacy. I close this chapter of my life with clarity and calm. No bitterness lingers, no anger clouds my mind, only the wisdom that comes from experience and patience. Truth has the power to right wrongs that emotion cannot, and patience has the power to turn suffering into justice. Final thought. He struck me 21 times, but truth struck once, and that strike will never fade.